Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here in this forum to have an opportunity to speak to you as a North American. Now, I'm going to jump right into the heart of the topic, which is North American politics, specifically the presidential race in the United States. It's something that everyone has clearly heard a great deal about. It's hard to avoid hearing about Donald Trump or Ted Cruz on the one hand, the Republican primaries, as well as Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, of course, in the Democratic primaries. But I want to address the issue from a particular angle. The fact is that when you think about the States and you're based in Europe, you think, gosh, these Americans, what planet are they from? Because you don't quite understand what drives them to the polls, what drives them to make the decisions that they're actually taking. You see the circus that is the Donald Trump campaign, and you think, how can that possibly sell? But it does. It drives voters to the polls, at least during the primaries, and it seems to have gotten a lot of people wound up. Whereas on the Democratic side, you probably have a lot more sympathy for Bernie Sanders because he is a self-professed socialist, and in Europe, socialism has not been painted communist red and the tool of the devil and so forth, as it has in the past in the United States. And Hillary, on the other hand, seems relatively lackluster. She doesn't seem to bring that much to the table. Everybody has seen her. She's been around the block. And there's not much sexy about the Hillary campaign, except that it's kind of the same old, same old. Well, let me give you the point of view of a particular slice of the American electorate, if you will. I'm going to speak as a Christian. And in the United States, you hear a lot about Christianity, about behaving with Jesus in your heart, thinking about what Jesus would do. And this is particularly true in the southern states, which have a strong history, whether it's in Utah with the Mormons or in other states with evangelicals. There are Catholics along the East Coast, and there are a variety of different Protestants throughout. And the fact is that in general, you tend to think, okay, Christian voters, right-wing voters, but that's not really true. All presidents and all presidential candidates have had to show their Christian credentials to have any shot at being elected. The fact is that if you're seen as an atheist or as simply a lapsed Christian, then you are pretty much shooting yourself in the foot right from the get-go. The reason for this can be traced back, obviously, to the founding fathers and the roots of the United States, but it's also something pretty fundamental. Americans, obviously not all of them, but Americans as a society are quite Christian. There isn't the same type of secular tradition that you find in France, for instance, where there was a clear separation of church and state. In the United States, because possibly of the Protestant influence on government, the idea was that you live out your faith. And so when you hold the highest office in the land, you have to have unimpeachable morals, which clearly isn't the case systematically. If you go back to some of the more recent Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton was very impeachable. He almost got impeached literally because of certain morally ambiguous judgments. Afterwards, if anything, there has been a winding up of this type of Christian rhetoric. George W. Bush showed very clearly that he was a very religious, faithful, devout person who would seek advice through prayer to be inspired by divine inspiration. He would pray along with Condoleezza Rice, who was at the time, at one point, his national security advisor, which is an extremely influential position because when you're at war, when you're fighting terrorists, national security is at the top of the agenda. And Barack Obama, while downplaying his own faith to a certain extent, certainly had very public appearances in churches and was required to speak about his faith and his wife's and how their family was a regular church-going family. in the current race, the situation is a bit strange because if you think about Donald Trump, the only church he goes to is the bank. He's not exactly your typical model Christian. And it's probably going to be an uphill battle for him to convince people that he is actually a God-fearing man. He's very much a New Yorker in that sense. God is great, but the greenback, the US dollar, is more important. And he's sold his campaign, sold his success on the basis of his financial savvy and his great deal-making skills. Interestingly, on the other side, on the Democratic side, if you look at Hillary Clinton, you may not have heard too much about her Christian credentials lately, but if you look back about a decade, they've been very much in evidence in the past. She was herself the daughter of a pastor. She was a very devout young Christian. She was part of all sorts of Christian groups. She was also one of the key participants during the Clinton years in the White House of what are called prayer breakfasts. Prayer breakfasts are essentially literally that. There's a meeting, there's breakfast, and people pray during the meeting in order to seek guidance. But as strange and foreign as that may sound, it's not so much of a cult mentality as simply a way of agreeing on what people have in common. So Christian values, or possibly those of all of the religions of the book, are shared, whether it's by Democrats or Republicans. And therefore, it was an important way of reaching consensus within, not so much with the White House, but within the House of Representatives, where there were often situations of deadlock because there was no way to find common ground. I think that in the run-up to the party conferences, the Democratic and Republican conferences that are going to officially nominate their nominee for the presidential race, we're going to start to hear more and more about this, also in part because there's a lot of money in Christian hands. There are a lot of church groups who believe that they have to play a very active part in politics, and therefore they spend heavily, whether on a candidate or on political action committees, which you, I'm sure, have heard of, these PACs, or super PACs, because often they're endowed with such huge funds, are extremely influential because they pay for advertising, they pay for lobbying, and they also provide a tremendous amount of resources to a campaign. And Christian PACs are very, very powerful. So I think that running up to the party conferences, and beyond that, in the actual presidential campaign that will unfold, I think we're going to start seeing a very Christian side of Hillary Clinton. I have trouble imagining the same for Donald Trump, who is the likely Republican candidate. And on some level, that's probably what bothers the Republican management and leadership the most. In the past, they've always relied on these core Christian voters as some of the key Republican voters. They were part of the crucial base that was always ready to go out and vote, because Democrats, by and large, are seen as secular, are seen as relatively immoral, especially in the more Bible-thumping states, whereas Republicans always had some amount of credentials in this field. And the tables are going to be turned, I think. But at the same time, is that really a bad thing? After all, Christianity and religion in general is not partisan. There's no reason why Christians should systematically lean towards the Republicans in the United States. Quite the contrary, you tend to not hear a lot about them, but there are a lot of Christian groups, as well as Christian newspapers, who tend to favor more progressive candidates because they believe that the focus should be on social justice, on equality, and on a variety of measures that are typically spearheaded by Democrats. So in a nutshell, The reason that Christianity and faith is so important to Americans is because they are a devout people. It's going to church on Sundays is a mainstay of American society, whether it's in rural areas or in big cities. And moreover, when you are in in the most important seat in the most important office in the land, and you've got literally your finger on the button and could set off nuclear war or mass bombings. You could have the economy plunge based on a misstep or a bad decision. You, as a voter, want to make sure that the person in that seat has some good inspiration and good moral backbone. And how else can you establish that if not through the lens of a candidate's faith? And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to end on that note. I think that we're likely, just to recap, to see a lot more religious talk in the days and weeks and months to come. And I think in many ways that should be a good thing, because it may actually help the Democrats pull away some of this core Christian demographic from a systematically Republican vote and show through Hillary, who is very faithful, very, very Christian, very pragmatic as well, that there are many different ways of interpreting your faith, and that progress and Christianity do not have to be contradictory. Thank you very much.